and I'm half of the lectures team here at CUSP, and it's our huge pleasure to welcome Dr. Carey King to our virtual talk tonight to discuss his work on energy systems, the environment, and economics. So the structure of the evening, after a quick introduction, Carey will present for around half an hour, followed by plenty of time for questions and discussions. If you have questions throughout the talk, feel free to pop them in the chat or keep them in mind until the end, and we'll ask you to unmute and ask your questions yourself. If you would prefer for Agirus or me to ask the question on your behalf, just indicate that by typing "please ask" or something like that in the chat. So to introduce our speaker, Dr. Carey King is a research scientist at the University of Texas, Austin, and his interdisciplinary research on energy, environment, and economics looks at how social institutions and policy trades off between these three powerful forces. In the course of his career, Dr. King has, amongst many other projects, developed models which lend real-world energy concepts to macroeconomics and considered the impacts of a changing energy landscape on the macroeconomy. Last year, Carey published a book entitled The Economic Superorganism, in which he explores narratives of energy, growth, and policy. In the book, Carey compares competing future energy scenarios and aims to help readers distinguish the technically possible from the socially viable. I thoroughly look forward to learning about that myself, Carey, so without further ado, I will hand over the virtual microphone to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sarah stated, I'm going to time myself starting now for 27 minutes, so I make sure I start and have at least 30 minutes at the end. So feel free to ask follow-up questions on more details. So I'm going to try to go sort of quickly through just some concepts that I discuss in the book and attempts to think about systems in the real world, physical world, and biology, and how these translate to patterns that we see in our economy. So this is just a summary of the chapter contents of the book. But in chapter 1, I basically go over these energy and economic narratives. So here is a reverse color image of UK flag. And so here, this is maybe many of you have gone through this exercise, but just look at the white square in the center and sort of focus your eyes on that here for 5 seconds or so. So I'm just going to count it down for 3, 2, 1, and then I take it away. And if you're not colorblind, you would see the actual color image of the flag, and it has a red cross in the center from the English flag. So why to show this? So I take this from a lecture I saw by Daniel Dennett, a philosopher, and he used the American flag, but it's the same kind of idea here. And what he says is, I'm changing his quote a little bit, but you are experiencing a red cross, but there does not exist a red cross that you are experiencing. So what that means is I show you the reverse color image of the flag, I take it away, the screen is not exhibiting the color red, but your mind has created the color red, as well as the blue parts of the flag. And so when we think about looking at data and about describing the real world or the economy or physical things, we think about the economy, it made me think, it's like, well, you could just say this about the economy. You are experiencing an economy, but there does not exist an economy that you are experiencing. And by that, I mean, multiple people experience different kinds of economic activities, buy things, sell things, are part of a certain country that has a certain set of rules and policies in place, but there's not a single economic experience that every single person experiences exactly the same. So in some sense, everybody's seeing a different part of the real world, and we might analyze data to understand commonalities across different areas. So in some, I showed you this, which is the reverse color image of the flag, and then when I took it away, you constructed this in your head. And in a similar way, we observe things, physical things in the world. I'm an energy guy, so I think about energy. So we think it's a barrel of oil. We can count this as the volume of oil, 42 gallons. A kilowatt hour of electricity. We have instruments to measure. We can count people. We can count machines. And we can even count things not on Earth. We can count stars and look at them and try to imagine our place in the solar system and the universe. So these are things we can observe, and then we try to come up with ideas that help us explain these observations. Gross domestic product itself is an accounting construct that we came up with. The definition has changed slightly over time. Energy is a concept itself, right? We use the concept of energy. And by using this concept and associating it with a set of mathematics, this helps us explain how phenomena change in the real world. So energy is an emergent concept because we had to come up with the idea. But other people we might think of social value, value socially, value economically, social equity. These are all kinds of constructs we try to understand whether we want more or less or what of value we might want. And of course, regulations are rules that we create to structure behavior, but these are also in that sense emergent. They have to follow physical laws, or at least our behaviors have to follow physical laws, but we have a very large degree of freedom, we might say, to choose things as emergent beings ourselves, humans that have evolved over time. So in essence, we need theory to connect observations with emergent concepts, or we come up with words that we might call emergent concepts like energy and GDP. And these, the more we rely on these, the more we must prove that they are indeed robust and have the theory or the laws of physics, if you will, to establish that they are indeed robust, going through the scientific process. But most people are not going through scientific process. They're not making mathematical models. They're just hearing narratives. And my book basically explores energy and economic narratives. So here's just a simple explanation of narrative, a story that connects and explains a carefully selected set of supposedly true events or experiences intended to support a particular viewpoint or thesis. But for my purposes, I actually don't even need the word supposedly, in the sense that people can look at economic data and people can look at energy data, and even agreeing upon how the data are derived and where they come from and their veracity, even agreeing upon all that, they can come up with different viewpoints or theses about what the data mean. And this is related to the narratives and what they know about the world. So there are these two axes, these energy and economic narratives. To simplify, on one side of the energy narrative says fossil fuels are essentially the best. On the other side of the energy narrative would be renewable energy systems are the best. And you might argue for or against either one. On the economic narratives, the extremes I pose are: one, techno-optimism, which is to say infinite substitutability, the ability to make new technologies to address social problems, not just say economic growth problems, but social problems more generally. And on the other side, I did not make it techno-pessimism, but I made it techno-realism, which is to say that the Earth is finite and there are limits to technological change or technological substitution. And these are informed by physical laws and physical constraints. Could be second law of thermodynamics, first law of thermodynamics, but it could be just physical size of the Earth as well. So depending on where you are, or any book or something like this might fit within the spectrum. Here is our Texas Governor Abbott speaking on Fox News after the blackouts a few weeks ago here in Texas. And this is just a quote from his. So this shows this blackout of partial blackout of the Texas electricity grid shows how the Green New Deal would be a deadly deal for the United States of America. So given that the Green New Deal doesn't exist yet in law, it's a concept, and that it certainly has not been implemented in any way in Texas, this is a very strange statement to show that a place that has no Green New Deal shows can go into blackout and shows how that's going to harm us. But here's a book that's sort of an easy one to place on this energy and economic axes, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, Alex Epstein. Some of you may or may not be familiar. The book is basically what it sounds like in the title. So it's a good title for the book. And this is just one statement from it, right? In fact, modern solar and wind technology do not produce reliable energy, period. So he's got the word reliable in there, says they're not reliable. He's very pro-fossil because he's very pro-human in terms of protecting humans. Humans are his basis for thinking about morality in the book, human well-being. Here's a statement you can find many others, but here's just one that says that is pro-renewable and says it's reliable. So there's a clear trend worldwide towards renewable energy, including wind energy. And that is because it is cheap, it is green, it is reliable, and it is safe. So again, It's the same wind turbines we're talking about, the same physical world we're talking about. One says wind energy is reliable, one says it's not. So how do we understand disagreements along the energy axis? Why people might say one thing versus another on fossil fuels versus renewables. And I'm saying it's very hard to understand why they might say this if you don't understand how someone's thinking about the economic axes. What's their economic narrative? Are they techno-optimistic or are they more techno-realistic? And you can be roughly anywhere within these axes, and it's not a clear-cut way to place any given statement, but some are more obvious than others. So my book tries to put these two things together. So I consider this kind of sequence of thinking about energy and the economy. So the first, I'm a physical scientist, mechanical engineer by official training. So we have physical laws, and these physical laws and other constraints describe how we can use and access energy, right? Second law of thermodynamics, et cetera. How can we harness energy from the real world, from the environment? So this gives a definition for energy resources. These energy resources and technologies physically power the economy via use in machines, buildings, and other physical capital, right? So we take resources, run them through machines, and they do work effectively. So this now goes to the economy. So third, now our interpretation of the economy in turn informs policy. So we go from energy to economy to policy. And policy affects social outcomes by designing markets, regulations, taxes, and other kinds of instruments that might affect the distribution of money. And then once we have this distribution of money, these rules they can come back full circle to affect energy resource extraction. So all these rules and money distribution can affect energy resource extraction and consumption, leading back to the beginning in a feedback loop of understanding the relations between energy and the economy. So again, this to summarize shortly here, energy, so physics or engineering type concepts and technology. Energy drives the economy. Nothing moves, no economic transaction generally can occur without an energy transformation. The economy informs policy. What we think the economy is, how we model the economy informs policy. Policy therefore affects society, and then society can in turn affect energy in the sense of, lobbying for one type of energy or another, or thinking about addressing climate change. So now I'm going to go through just a few charts here on long-term trends or historical energy usage and costs, which is one of the things that made me start to write the book several years ago. But these are data really from Roger Fouquet's at the London School of Economics that I put in the book. This is total energy consumption in England and the United Kingdom, primary energy consumption by source. So we can clearly see the rapid rise after the invention of the steam engine in the modern Watts sort of version of the steam engine in the mid 1700s, and coal use ramping up tremendously after that time. So this is just typical primary energy consumption in units of power, right? It's exajoules per year. And here is the cost of that energy consumption. And this is money spent on energy to provide certain energy services labeled here as like power, for example. Physical power is an energy service. So this is money spent on fuels to provide these energy services divided by the GDP of England and the United Kingdom. So the purpose of showing this is if it's a high number, then this is relatively costly energy. If it's a low number, it's relatively cheap energy for the economy overall. So this is kind of a measure of the industrialization and fossil fuel transition in general, that food and fodder in the pre-industrial times are basically, power is basically the main energy service, and it's costing almost the entire cost of energy is almost associated with physical power, either through animals, which would be under the case of blue here, the power would be animals and feeding them fodder for animals to do work. It include also water wheels and windmills, non-electrical windmills as well. But food, feeding physical labor, human muscles is also a big component. So most of the power in pre-industrial is muscle power, and then heat and industrial and transport come along. So only until the late 1800s, before that time, the United Kingdom spent more than 20% of its GDP on energy. So if you added up all energy spending and divided by GDP, it was greater than 20%. So clearly the fossil transition and industrialization is what lowered this cost and enabled the buildup of capital and physical infrastructure that we have around us, and enabled a jump in population as well. So this is relative. This is one of my favorite charts, just gives a long-term historical perspective on cheap versus costly energy. Most of the discussions about whether energy is cheap or expensive is really only focused on the last 100 years maximum on this chart on the right, or maybe even only the last 50 years or 60 years. So here's the coal production. Yeah, so we can see the coal production in the United Kingdom overlaid on this. And so that's when the power, basically the cost of power, basically declines quickly because of steam engines providing the power, coal power. So here's a similar chart for the world primary energy consumption, historically dominated by Europe and the United States. Importantly, there's no single technology type or energy extraction technology and resource that is declining in an absolute number per year of consumption. Coal is getting close, so we're getting close to whether we might be no longer increasing the rate of extraction of coal, but even biomass, right? So biomass extraction has increased over time. It hasn't decreased. So we're basically adding on top of each other, and that's always important to note and think from an evolutionary standpoint as well. The unique thing about this chart is that the rate of change post-World War II until the 1970s is unprecedented. So only the bottom chart shows a 10-year average rate of change of energy consumption. So this is how fast is energy per year increasing globally. It's dominated again by Europe and the United States. But only that time was it over 4% a year. So energy consumption was increasing over 4% a year globally, only during these glorious 30 years, as the French might call it. And so anytime we think about, well, let's just go back to policies that worked in the 1950s and 1960s, whether in the US or somewhere else, inequality was higher, or there was less income inequality during this time. We can start to ask ourselves how the rate of consumption of energy affects the structure of society itself, including the distribution of income. I won't show any charts on that, but I'm just throwing that idea in your head, and I can show other things, some charts on that as well. If we look at the world cost of food and energy, which is sort of the equivalent concept that I showed for the UK, around the year 2000, in my mind, seems to maybe be the cheapest food and energy ever in the history of mankind. It went up after 2000 due to the commodities boom and China joining the World Trade Organization, these kinds of ideas. So this is, I think, a hidden factor in plain sight, if you will, that is essentially constraining policy options in ways that people don't understand. So this is one of the things I'm looking to understand further. Okay, so that's just a background on some energy cost data. And now, what are some sort of systems thinking for energy and the economy, and particularly what's the size of the system and how is it structured? Biological systems, there are parallels to the economy. So I'm just going to give a short intro to that. So here's a quote from Howard Odum. He was an ecologist that studied, ecological systems and their networks and how they trade nutrients. And he applied these same principles to understanding the economy as well. And he says, it is sometimes said that no system can understand itself. A logical extension of this theorem is that the system in its shared network of information processing does not completely understand itself. The way a system can understand itself is to develop simplified ideas, sometimes called models of itself, which have enough of the main features to have some reality, but are simple enough to be understood. So let's just say you and I are in part of a system that we call the economy, and we're part of the earth. And what he's saying is we can't actually understand 100% of it, but we can try to get pretty close. So the question is, how close can we get? So to understand systems, I was thinking and writing the book, you need to understand size and structure together, not just think about size, not just think about structure by itself, but understand how size, you might say growth, and the structure or distribution of things are maybe coupled together in ways we don't understand. To think about that, we can think about three concepts: matter, information, and energy. Depending on how philosophical you could get, you could just boil those all down to one. If there's any physicists, they could tell me how to boil them all down to one. But that's how I think about it. So matter is basically asking how much is there, how much stuff is there. Information is essentially for whatever matter you have, how do you arrange it? How is it configured? You can think about just different materials, steel versus iron, or different kinds of alloy metals. They're same building block components, they're just arranged, atoms are arranged in different ways. And then energy, which is how much effort does it take to arrange the matter in the way that you want? So I've got some matter, I know how I want to do it, how much energy does it take to form it or to extract it, or something like this. So these three concepts each have these sort of, are essentially addressing these three different questions. So probably one of the more classic ways to think about structure and size is what's often known as Kleiber's rule from Max Kleiber, and looked at this starting in the 1930s. And he started looking at the mass of animals and their basal metabolism. So it's called heat production per day on the y-axis, but essentially their basal metabolism, or their constant intake of food, you might say, energy consumption. And so he found out that they scale not linearly. If you increase mass by 10 times, then you have 10 times to the 3/4 power gives you something like 5.6. So if I have a 10 times more massive animal, it doesn't consume 10 times more food, it consumes something like 5.6 times more food. And so when he figured this out by simply plotting the data that he had at the time, say it's not a linear relation, it's this approximate 3/4 power rule, scaling metabolism to mass. And it's also not a 2/3 rule, which some people would posited that, okay, it should be 2/3 because this has a mass to volume ratio concept embedded in it in terms of dissipating heat from a sphere. If you say, you would have to scale 2/3 to be able to dissipate that heat. Some other studies looking at this, here's one from 2010, looked at the scaling relation of mammals that have a circulatory system leading from a single heart, or where the blood is pumped from a single heart, and said, no, it's the network structure internally of the animals that can help us explain the 3/4 power rule. So it's not about heat dissipation, but it's about internal distribution. So there are many, I guess, competing ideas and thoughts about how this works, but this 3/4 power rule, one of the important points to take away from it is it about 1? Is it greater than 1, or is it less than 1? So with the Kleiber's rule, it's less than 1. And these are adult mammals that they're looking at. Here, people have looked at these same scaling relations for ant colonies. So it's not a single animal, but it's a superorganism, if you will, of an ant colony. And these all also have sublinear scaling laws. So the metabolic rate of the ant colony overall, all ants plus the fungus, if they're fungus farming ants, scale sublinear with their mass. So the open circles and the gray circles are fungus farming ants. The open circles are particularly leaf cutting ants. And then the black circles are hunter gathering ants that just gather seeds and things and forage and bring them back into the nest. So these also seem to exhibit a sublinear scaling law, although perhaps different. And there's maybe various scaling laws depending on the environment and the particular structure of the colony. So we have this potential range of mature and large organisms, I would say, as opposed to single-celled organisms, which I'll mention here next, that might be in some range of linear scaling to, some sublinear scaling, maybe as low as a half. So there's some things to understand there, but it's not, all organisms do not scale sublinearly. So here's an interesting chart that says, if you look at bacteria, for example, or single-celled prokaryotes, they have superlinear scaling. So if you 10 times more mass of bacteria, they consume more than 10 times energy to go up to that rate. The middle section here of the circles are single-celled eukaryotes. So this would be or protists, they're labeling here. This would be something like an amoeba. And so you could say amoebas scale roughly linearly. You have a 10 times larger size amoeba that's going to consume 10 times more energy. And then at the top, you have multi-celled organisms, eukaryotes, and these again have this sublinear scaling law. So as you basically have coordination amongst multiple entities, if you will, organs in a body, cells in a multi-celled organism, this might essentially necessitate a sublinear scaling law to be able to increase the number of cells or organs. And the economy, so here's the link to the economy, is that the global economy essentially scales like animals or ant colonies, or at least we could, I think it does. And that gives us some basis to say that the economy is superorganism. So this chart is global primary energy on the y-axis. It's not a log scale. And then global GDP, real GDP on the x-axis. And from, so the available worldwide data from around 1900 until 1970, you have about a 1-to-1 scaling. In the sense, one more unit of GDP was associated with one more unit of primary energy consumption. And then after the 1970s, we have something like a 2/3 scaling. So GDP increases 3 times, energy consumption only increases 2 times. So we have a sublinear scaling relation. So you could counter this with, it didn't become a superlinear scaling relation, for example, or it didn't continue to be linearly all until the present time. So most people interpret this, I would say, as increasing efficiency. Our economy got more efficient, and we chose to do this. It was a policy choice or engineering design. But I posited to you in the previous slides, you could think, okay, did a sublinear scaling rule for multi-celled organisms come about because they made a policy choice to become more efficient? It'd be hard to say yes. So these basically have a similar type structure. In terms of scaling, their size and their structure, right? So this is one way to look at size and structure, that the scaling laws essentially derive in some way from internal structure, and we can try to think about that. I'm going to try to finish here in 5 minutes, but the idea that the global economy, yes, we can consider it as a superorganism, something that takes in energy from the environment, maintains itself in size and structure, and then attempts to extract more resources to grow, like other organisms do, and they're competing. Richard Dawkins, 1976, wrote The Shellfish Gene, in which he posed that essentially genes are the core component of evolution, and that we are organisms that are just containers, survival machines, he says, for genes. And so it's not the individual organisms that are competing to survive in natural selection. Well, it's the organisms that are competing in natural selection, but they're doing it in some sense at the behest of genes. Organisms, of course, reside within the ecosystems. They're tailored to them, which for the most part exist on Earth. In the book, he also essentially invented the word meme, came up with the meme. And so he says, just as genes propagate themselves in the gene pool by leaping from body to body, sperms and eggs, so memes propagate themselves in the meme pool. And so when you think about memes, these are essentially technologies. So the circles on the right are my attempt at the equivalent concept of the biological evolution idea, from information in genes to ecosystems. To here we have information, which we might say is technology, or memes, ideas for how to do things. Companies can essentially house this technology. Multiple companies can have the same technology, like computers, for example. And these companies exist within larger economies and countries, maybe across different countries and the Earth as well. So we can try to make this parallel concept between, and this is not unique for me by any means, of thinking about how economic actors compete or must somehow fulfill, whether they have to fulfill the same kind of, address the same pressures as biological evolution. So this gets us to the maximum power principle, and I'll try to wrap up here in just 3 minutes. And the maximum power principle was originally, I believe, an idea from Alfred Lotka, an ecologist, and then Howard Odum followed up on it later. So the maximum power principle says that the more lasting and hence more probably dynamic patterns of energy flow or power, including the patterns of living systems and civilizations, tend to transform and restore the greatest amount of potential energy at the fastest possible rate. So those things that survive tend to be the things that consume the most energy. It's essentially what it's saying, and they're mostly looking at biological systems. To understand this, the translation would be organisms that survive via natural selection tend to be those that follow the maximum power principle. And so more resource consumption translates to more fitness. You have a higher chance of surviving, which means you have a higher chance of passing off offspring. And then therefore the genes within you have a higher chance of propagating into the future. And so he's I'll skip this for time and go to another idea here from Karsten Hermann Polath, who's a German philosopher and economist. And so we can translate this to ourselves, humans, as agents, and then who have we have culture, we have memes, we have, as far as we can tell, the highest, maybe not the highest level of intelligence of all living creatures. Other mammals can probably compete with that, we just don't know. But he states here that we can consider human agency as a special case of an evolved function, in the sense that we are evolved we are some culmination of evolution to this point. So the maximum power principle, as a principle of natural selection, also operates for all extensions, such as technology. And so this means if we are an evolved creature and we invent a technology, then that is also itself a part of evolution. So this means, he says in the middle, that a steam engine, together with the human agent using it, is just another manifestation of a physical inference device, which evolves, for example, in the direction of higher efficiency. Higher efficiency follows maximum power principle in the sense of maximizing work output. And ultimately, the steam engine is just one way to increase the steepness of the gradient of energy dissipation and hence entropy production. So just to summarize what he's saying there, human agency is an evolved function. This could be the same as all evolved capabilities. Humans are not. And here a function is basically any process that helps generate information to understand essentially how the world works, understand causality that's consistent with how the world works. And our brains are prediction devices, what he calls physical inference devices. And we're trying to basically understand the physical world. And if we understand it more, what would we do? So why would we seek to understand causality, as Hermann Polath is saying? Why would we seek causality to explain the natural world? And one answer I say could be to prove we have become better physical inference devices, right? To prove I know things better than somebody else. But why would we care to become a better physical inference device in general? Why would we care to better understand the world? And the translation of the maximum power principle is to consume more energy and convert it to useful work. If you have questions, I can show you how useful work as a concept, which is basically how much work is the economy doing on the environment, and that GDP essentially translates one-to-one with useful work. Basically, all the work of all our machines translates one-to-one with GDP. And then third, why would we seek to produce more useful work? Because in the context of evolution, in competition of natural selection, performing work at a higher rate increases the odds that both the biological organism survives to pass on its genes, and as well that companies and economies would survive to pass on their memes, technologies, and culture. So you could argue capitalism and markets are becoming more prominent probably than less so over the last 100 years and 50 years. And then you could think about, okay, is that because of it has some technology meme that lends that economy taking on that concept to produce more useful work, and does that make them more able to survive or compete against other economies? I might well skip that. So this could go into markets. Friedrich Hayek posed the idea of having markets and price mechanisms to basically keep people from thinking about what they're doing, right? Is this the purpose of a market? And if you don't consciously think about what you're doing, then you might just respond to signals that therefore increase the maximum power. So he says in the middle, the goal is to dispense with the need of conscious control and how to provide inducements which will make the individuals do the desirable things without anyone having to tell them what to do. So he's like, why would you create markets? Because they can process information in ways that individuals can't. And then that information will be better to act upon than individual thinking and reasoning. So he promoted markets to generate these prices. These prices are then the inducements that induce us to do the desirable things, as he says. So maybe I'll stop there so we can have discussion, and I'll just leave this slide up as anyone starts forming their questions. But what can we say is the purpose of the economy? I sort of just posed this. This is not even original to me, from the limits to growth, even from 1972. That the energy and economic data support purpose of the economy could be that the purpose of the economy is to maximize average rate of useful work output. That's consistent with the maximum power principle, sort of consistent with thinking about biological evolution. A quote from the 1972 Limits to Growth says, the apparent goal of the present world system is to produce more people with more, essentially, stuff, making more consumption for each person. And if you want to have more things, more consumption for each person, you're going to need more useful work for that. And useful work here is again, a thermodynamic concept of essentially energy times efficiency of conversion to useful work. And if you have questions on that, I can show some slides. But I will stop there for the sake of trying to stay within 30 minutes. So
thank you very much. That was really interesting introduction to your book, the content of your book. Thank you for that. I will let everybody ask questions, but I'm just going to kick us off with one of my own because it was related to your last slide. So your work links really interestingly concepts from sort of biology and earth sciences to economics. Similarly, like you said, to limits of growth, and also the Descriptor report here in the UK, which was published just last month. And it seems like there's quite a lot of there aren't a lot of sort of research. There isn't a lot of research which links those two things, particularly sort of from the economic side. And I was wondering why you think that those gaps exist, and like how could economics be improved by considering these sort of biological and energy concepts?
Right. Not being a traditionally educated economist, but coming into it now from most of the post-Keynesian variety, if people familiar with that, I would say that economists are not taught to think about how the physical world affects economic phenomena. And in some sense, it's reasonable since the fossil fuel era and the economic theories we have are mostly derived. There's a lot of thought in, say, the 1800s, but the mathematics and the sort of theories that we use are mostly derived in the last 100 years, when the constraints on economic activity were becoming less and less constrained by physical resources. And so if you come up with theories and economic techniques that ignore the role of resources because you think they're not constraining, then if they do become constraining, you're not going to realize it because you don't have the concept of resources in your thinking and in your modeling to begin with. So I think it's just basically the lack of actually integrating the concept of energy would be the most important, but also physical resources as mass. It's the lack of integrating that concept into economic growth modeling and thinking about distribution, perhaps, as well as other things that basically lend economists to generally think that energy is not a constraining factor on economic growth. And then that leads to policies that people are becoming more and more disillusioned with because they're becoming, if you can't explain things like financial crisis and increasing private debt levels, I think a lot of these things are effectively ultimately linked to long-term trends of resource constraints. Not constraints in the sense that we're declining, but constraints in the sense that you can't grow as fast as you might otherwise like to.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
I see one question in the chat if you want me to.
Yes.
Go over that.
Yeah, there's somebody's messaged me. Steph, do you have a question that you'd like to ask? If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I didn't know what the best way to do it was, but that's fine. I work for the International Energy Agency Clean Coal Center, which we do research on basically trends of what's going on in the coal world with technology, but also economics and policy trends regarding development of coal and things like that. And basically there's something I'm looking at the moment is looking at the development patterns in low income countries, developing countries. Many are still following more of a traditional energy intensive pathway of development. And at the same time, in energy and economics research, there's a lot of talk about how, costs of renewable energy are falling. And there's also a potential for leapfrogging, where countries who don't have, a big investment in fossil fuels, for example, might be able to sort of skip that stage and move straight to new technologies such as wind, solar, batteries, etc. So it seems like whether or not countries decide to follow this more like traditional and energy intensive fossil-based pathway or try to skip straight to more of a renewables-based strategy comes down a lot to the country's policy choices. But at the same time, the narratives around fighting climate change and the different actions that like each country or even individuals have to take is often looked upon as quite like I think like a Western sort of developed country narrative, whereas a lot of developing countries really are focused on, like you're saying, you know, growing their economies in a very like traditional manner of like increasing output, increasing energy input to increase energy output, right? So basically, do you think that these sort of social narratives of fighting climate change are going to be able to overcome that sort of traditional biological pathway of input for output development? Or do you think that do you think they're going to basically, do you think countries are going to continue to use fossil fuels for these, you know, basic economic development reasons? Or
No.
are we going to have sort of other, are they going to start to take into account other more social rather than purely economic issues? I hope that makes sense.
Right. That's a good question. I do in the book sort of talk about the concept of leapfrogging, developing countries leapfrogging. Not being a development economist or studying developed countries in much detail at all, I'm skeptical of the idea in the sense of if you don't have the capability to generate the technology yourself, maybe you have some capability to maintain it once it's there, but you would need to want to develop that as well as other kinds of support capabilities, hospitals and education systems and these kinds of things. It's hard to imagine how you could leapfrog the technologies of the developed world to have in some sense a better system by depending on the developed world itself to sell you the technologies and potentially train you. So unless the developed world said, yes, we're going to help develop a grid, say in sub-Saharan Africa, that is more from scratch and low carbon than the ones we have, if you want to make a profit on it, it's probably not going to help them as much as it would if you didn't make a profit on it. So I give one example of, I think, Mobisol, that was the company selling small solar systems in Africa. And, you know, the investors or, you know, OECD, investors that are looking for 7 or 10% rate of return on lending, you know, systems to pay back over long periods of time in Africa. And, you know, they ended up going under and getting sold to NG. So, yeah, I'm sort of skeptical of it, but we're basically running the test that you say. So your question was, you know, if we have these social desires and these trends to try to say, let's just say, address climate change more broadly, not just in developing countries, the observation is that we're not, right? So is it because of there's real physical principles that and competition type ideas that are preventing us from doing it, even though we keep saying the right things, right? Paris Accord is signed by all major countries now, with the US back in. And almost every economic study says, hey, if you convert to low carbon, the economy is going to grow. But they also say if you don't convert to the economy is going to grow and we're going to be fine there. So I think it's because of the problems with economic modeling, not considering energy as a fundamental concept in how the economy grows, they're misleading policymakers into what's possible, or at least into the relationships between going low carbon and economic growth. I think it's much more constrained.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'll stop there. Yeah. So yeah,
that's great. Thank you so much.
There's probably a physical. So yes, I do believe there's a physical reason why it's not happening, and people aren't recognizing it. They might recognize it directly, but I think they need to think about it more.
Thanks.
To Sarah, I have some questions which apparently are maybe directly to me from the chat. So, but I'll let you.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll just go down the list.
Thank you.
Could I comment on success value of maximum power principle maximizers versus other strategies, both biological and economic systems over different timeframes relative to each system? Probably not. Probably can't, to say that I've studied this to have a lot of other examples in comparison with other strategies. I can say that there's another person who thinks about, that I've been discussing with, a researcher who thinks about hierarchy, social organization and hierarchy in companies or organizations or economies. And I guess we're sort of going back and forth. He's like, no, it's socially imposed hierarchy that leads to economic inequality, for example, how many managers you have, these kinds of things. And I keep thinking that it's only the size of a system that essentially forces some level of hierarchy upon the system if it wants to grow, in the sense that you can't grow without having some hierarchy, which would then lead to a sublinear scaling law. So that I don't really know the answer there, but that's an area of interest. Yeah, so I think your question is a very good one, but I think I don't have the answer. At the different timescales, definitely, you had a comment there, and that's definitely a question. But I guess the only thing on timescales might be, the maximum power principle is is it an average concept that this species or this group of organisms with the same genetic code on average consume more power, or is it consuming more power at every instant? Certainly not every single instant, in the sense that we don't eat constantly until we burst. Some animals, I think, do, or some organisms do, but yeah, so in some sense, it's some rate of production, but it also includes the mass of reproduction as well. There's some interesting work from James Brown, who's now retired from University of New Mexico, and one paper with Charles Hall, who's an ecologist, and they essentially posit and wrote a paper saying that the mass production, there's a constant relationship between energy consumption and mass production, and across basically, I think they're basically saying all of biology, and that includes offspring. So if I get to an adult stage and I don't grow anymore, my mass is now going into offspring. And so I still need to count that mass, and there's a constant energy per mass. So there's something there to try to think about as well. Triple question, here's another one. How does GDP correlate to useful work? Does capitalism enforce that energy leading to profits trump energy leading to useful work? So I'll just show some charts from that, just so I don't have to describe it. It's easier to show it. So chapter 6 is about economic growth modeling. And I basically lean on some work by Robert Ayers, used to be at INSEAD, and I just skipped over it, and his student Benjamin Warr, who was a student at the time. Well, I guess here's the USA example. So here's the USA example. So what is useful work? You can basically think of useful work as this idea: fuel input into a machine, energy content of the fuel into a machine that has an efficiency, and then what comes out is mechanical work. It could be lighting from a light bulb, industrial process heat for chemical processing, something like this. But you can think about it largely as mechanical work. And so people that they did the work of sort of adding this up. These are data from the United States that they calculated the 20th century. And so this is the efficiency of converting primary energy to useful work. So this is like the aggregate efficiency of the whole economy, and taking in primary energy and then spitting out useful work. And it goes from, say, 4% to something like 12% by the year 2000. So if you plot these two things next to each other, you get a pretty close to one-to-one relationship. GDP on the left, the white line, useful work on the right, the red line. And if you just said, I'm going to take useful work and divide it by a conversion factor of 1.9, you would get this green dashed line, which shows you get a pretty good match. So interestingly, this time when you have this increasing useful work relative to GDP, this is the time of highest income equality. So therefore this kind of lends back to thinking about that. So that's the short answer of it. I show some other examples of some other countries that have been studied, and some papers of theirs. But that's the short a short take on that. So let me try to look at the chat window again. If politics aims for higher GDP, is that just a narrow way of understanding productivity? So yeah, so I guess productivity. So so let me just go into the idea of total factor productivity here. Let me do down. So if we look at the change in useful work efficiency that I just showed you for the United States, that's the white line. So what is the rate of change of efficiency? If it's a positive number, then efficiency is going up, and if it's a negative number, efficiency is going down. So you get some fluctuations here, and again, there's a high level of useful work efficiency in the post-World War II years, 2 or 3 decades, just like primary energy consumption. On the right is a red line with data from the U.S. Federal Reserve, San Francisco, and that's a 10-year running average of the change in total factor productivity. So given the definition of the neoclassical growth model, total factor productivity is the residual GDP growth after accounting for capital and labor. And so I'm just kind of showing here that these seem to be they follow the same basic trend. So those of us in sort of this exergy economics community are sort of close to the mindset that productivity really is increasing efficiency, basically. And that productivity isn't, we might have to think of the idea in our head, but ultimately the way it translates to productivity in the GDP sense is if we can manifest the idea in our head in a machine that operates in the real world that has increased efficiency. So that's the translation there. So hopefully that addresses that question.
There's a, sorry, I'm not sure if this is in your chat, but there's a question from Melanie who asks about the sort of the role of human agency and policy in this relationship, this economic superorganism relationship.
Yeah,
so
yeah, the next one I see. So yeah, so this one's a good one. And so in chapter 9, I approached the idea somewhat this way, talking about degrees of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So we have many, in engineering, we talk about degrees of freedom. I use a simple, there's a pivoting lever has 1 degree of freedom. It can rotate around a fixed point. If I have a 2-bar problem or a 2-bar pendulum, if you will, now it has sort of 2 degrees of freedom. It has 2 dimensions that it can describe what the position of a 2-bar pendulum. And so when we think about the degrees of freedom in the economy or humans do things, now it's some astronomically high number degree of freedom. And so we tend to think we have, this is my perspective on it, that agency or ability to make any, for the most part, decision we want because the degrees of freedom are so high. So my book doesn't answer this question, ultimately about human agency directly, but it does posit that our decisions tend to get directed in a certain way per the maximum power principle or maximizing useful work. And that GDP is in effect a proxy for useful work, as the slides we're showing here with looking at GDP and useful work of the US economy. So you can ask, is GDP effectively a proxy for useful work, even though we don't think of it that way and it wasn't even derived in that way? If it is, then that would mean that ultimately we are trying to have more physical work production, and that is a physical thing. And then that would have potential, these natural selection feedbacks, that an economy doing more useful work will survive better than an economy that is not, and therefore survive to pass on its memes, which would include memes that are about producing more useful work, and whether capitalism is doing that or not. And so profits, the idea of profits of a company would be, in some sense, another proxy for, if you make things more efficient and produce more useful work, you will have more profits. That there would be that would be the hypothesis, that there's a direct relationship there. So hopefully in terms of policy and agency, at the end of Melanie's question, this probably goes to the question from the person from IEA. We can posit, we do have the degree of freedom to say go low carbon, but most people think there's not a trade-off between going low carbon and economic growth, so they just don't posit that there's a conflict. I certainly posit that there's a conflict. And so if we have the agency to go low carbon at the behest of more economic growth, right? Do we think that's more important? Because people don't think there's a trade-off, maybe they just don't even contemplate it. If you actually thought there was a trade-off, then you could at least start the agency of contemplating that and then decide which you want, right? You can't, by definition, you can basically generally not maximize two quantities or maximize one and minimize one. In this case, minimize CO2 emissions and maximize GDP. Those might be in conflict and you might have a trade-off. So I think that's just a natural way for me to think about it.
Thanks for your answer. I think it does answer it, but I think I was also trying to think that actually there's a maximal power and that some people have more power to exert their agency than others. And therefore there's an unequal distribution, and that can be a multilinear scales, but there does seem to just not, maybe most people do see a trade-off, but people in power don't. And so it's not necessarily doing what everyone wants or what everybody would think was more efficient. This inequality could, yeah.
All right. So I took this. So this book, this idea here is as old as I am. So I certainly didn't come up with it. Richard Adams is an anthropologist. So this maybe gets a little bit to your point. Certainly, this is my first thoughts on it that are in the book, and I probably don't have much more beyond that at this point. But he posits it's the actor's control of the environment that constitutes the base of social power. So social power being defined here as an ability to tell someone what to do something, that they have to do something that I do not have to do. You have to go low carbon and I don't, or it could be something like that. And so this is basically his idea. If you have entity A, social entity A could be an economy, A and B, each of them has some control over the environment. You could say the ability to extract energy and do useful work. And then they have some social relation between them. So he's saying that these are all intertwined. So for example, if entities A and B have equal control over the environment, which is to say the same technology, then neither has social power over the other, and they're sort of equal, and they have to deal with each other as equals socially. But if A has more control over the environment than B, it could have some social power over B and essentially tell entities in B what to do and force them to do it. So that's my, so it's probably about as far as I've gone on that idea. Somewhat on this, natural gas prices have been low in the United States, North America for the last 15, or well, not quite 15 years, but 10 to 12 years now. And if you had told somebody in 2006 that, hey, if the natural gas price was $3 a million BTU, would you install carbon capture on natural gas systems? And they probably would have said, yeah, let's do it because we can make it low carbon. Well, here we are, and there's still more impetus to lower carbon emissions. Yet we're not installing carbon capture systems on natural gas, even though natural gas is cheaper than anyone would have thought, and that it would probably be, the total price of carbon captured natural gas power would be less than people would have thought before the financial crisis. So that would be, I don't know, evidence to some degree that, yeah, we're just trying to maximize useful work and not lower carbon emissions, because if you lower the efficiency conversion of your power plant because you have carbon capture, that by definition is lowering useful work. So do we inherently realize that? Are we making that conscious choice? That's a great question. But
thank you. I think we're going to have to wrap up there because we just ticked over to 7 o'clock. But thank you so much, Carrie, for a really interesting talk. And I think that from the comments and certainly from my experience, we got lots of new buyers of your book in this session. So thank you very much. And thank you also to all our attendees. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question. There was a few more questions in the chat that we didn't quite get to. But I hope that, you can find the answers in the book perhaps. But thank you very much, and we will be sending out some more information on future CUSP talks in the next few weeks. So thank you.
You can email me your questions, and if you want them answered, and or shoot me on Twitter and see my website. So thank you very much for having me.